Struggling Cowboy sold his last horse. Not knowing it would return with his brother's killer, he sold his brother's horse to save the family ranch. But when that same horse came back riderless and wild-eyed, it carried with it the scent of blood and the shadow of his brother's killer. The sun hung low over Bitter Springs like a dying ember, casting long shadows across the dusty yard where Samuel Creek stood with his hand resting on Grace's neck. Her chestnut coat gleamed despite the grime of 3 hard years, and her dark eyes held the same gentle spirit that had drawn his brother Thomas to her all those seasons ago. Samuel's fingers trembled as they traced the familiar white star on her forehead. Grace had been Thomas's pride, the one thing he'd saved every penny for, working double shifts at the mine until his hands bled raw. She'd carried Thomas through his courting days, brought him home safe from town on Saturday nights, and stood vigil by his bedside during that fever 2 winters before he died. The bank letter felt like lead in Samuel's coat pocket. Final notice: 30 days to settle the debt or lose everything. The ranch their father had carved from wilderness, the house their mother had filled with laughter, the barn where he and Thomas had wrestled as boys and dreamed as men. All of it would belong to strangers if he couldn't raise $200 by month's end. Grace nickered softly and pressed her muzzle against his chest, as if sensing the storm gathering in his heart. Samuel closed his eyes and breathed in her scent, hay and leather, and something indefinably Thomas, as if his brother's ghost still lingered in her mane. "I know, girl," he whispered, his voice cracking like old leather. I know what he'd say, but Thomas wasn't here to say anything. Thomas lay cold under the cottonwood tree behind the house, 6 feet of Kansas earth between him and the world he'd loved. Samuel had carried his brother's body home across Grace's back that terrible night 3 years ago, her hoofbeats marking time like a funeral drum while his own heart shattered with each step. The killer had never been found. Jake somebody, the bartender had said, a drifter with silver spurs and dead eyes who'd put 2 bullets in Thomas over a poker dispute. By morning, he'd vanished like smoke, leaving nothing behind but blood on the saloon floor and a hole in Samuel's chest that winter wind whistled through. Samuel had spent everything hunting that ghost. Every dollar from the cattle sales, every cent from his mother's jewelry, every penny earned breaking his back on neighboring ranches. He'd ridden to Denver, to Dodge City, to every dusty town between Kansas and Colorado, chasing rumors and shadows. The whiskey helped numb the failure, but it couldn't wash away the taste of ash that had settled on his tongue the day Thomas died. Now Grace stood before him like a living piece of his brother's soul, and Samuel had to sell her to keep Thomas's grave from belonging to strangers. The horse trader waited by the fence, a thin man named Hutchins with calculating eyes and tobacco-stained teeth. He'd already examined Grace's legs, her teeth, her gait. A fine animal, he'd said, though the price would reflect her age and the hard times fallen on everyone these days. $80, Hutchins had offered. Cash money right now. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. But it might buy Samuel time to find work, to earn what remained, to hold on to the only home he'd ever known for a few months longer. Grace turned her head to watch a hawk circle overhead, her ears pricked forward with interest. She'd always been curious about the world, always eager for the next ride, the next adventure. Thomas used to laugh about it, how Grace had more wanderlust than a preacher's daughter and twice as much sense. The memory cut deep, and Samuel had to brace himself against her flank as the weight of 3 years crashed down on him. He'd failed his brother in every way that mattered. Failed to protect him that night in Millfield. Failed to find his killer. Failed to keep the ranch running without falling into debt. Now he was failing even to keep Thomas's beloved mare. "Mr. Creek?" Hutchins called, impatience sharpening his voice. "I got other business to attend to." Samuel straightened and looked into Grace's eyes, Thomas's eyes, dark and trusting and full of forgiveness he didn't deserve. She'd follow whoever bought her, because that was her nature. She'd serve faithfully and well, because that was how Thomas had raised her. But she'd never understand why her boy's brother had given her away. "I'm sorry," Samuel whispered against her ear. I am Sore, Thomas. He pulled the bridle from the fence post and slipped it over Grace's head with hands that remembered the motion from countless mornings. She accepted the bit without resistance, patient as always, trusting as always. The walk to Hutchins's wagon felt longer than the trail to Denver. She's broke to saddle and harness both, Samuel said as he handed over the reins, his voice steady despite the breaking in his chest. Gentle as a lamb with children, but she'll run all day if you need her to. Never seen her spook at gunfire or thunder. Hutchins nodded and counted out 8 $10 bills, the paper crisp and foreign in Samuel's work-worn hands. $80, the price of betrayal. The cost of keeping a promise to a dead brother while breaking another. Grace whinnied once as the wagon rolled away, a sound full of confusion and something that might have been accusation. Samuel watched until the dust swallowed her chestnut coat, then walked back to the empty corral with his hands full of money that felt like blood. The ranch house stood quiet in the gathering dusk, its windows dark and lifeless. Samuel climbed the porch steps Thomas had built, opened the door Thomas had painted, and sat down at the table where they'd shared their last meal together. The $80 lay scattered before him like fallen leaves, and for the first time since his brother's funeral, Samuel Creek put his head in his hands and wept. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn door Thomas used to oil every spring. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a sound like grief made audible like loneliness given voice. Samuel wiped his eyes and gathered up the money, his movements slow and deliberate. Tomorrow he'd ride to town and make arrangements with the bank. Tomorrow he'd start looking for work. Tomorrow he'd begin the long task of learning to live with what he'd done. But tonight, the silence felt deeper than any grave, and the emptiness where Grace should be echoed like a wound that would never heal. In the darkness beyond the window, something moved, a shadow that might have been a horse, a ghost, a memory. Samuel blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the whisper of wind through the cottonwood tree where his brother slept. The money burned in his pocket like a fever, and Samuel wondered if some betrayals were too deep to forgive, even when they were committed in the name of love. For 2 months, Samuel Creek lived with the ghost of his betrayal, until his brother's horse came galloping back through the darkness, carrying secrets that would turn his world to ash. The autumn cold had settled into Samuel's bones like an old wound, persistent and aching. 2 months since he'd sold Grace, 2 months of scraping by on odd jobs and the charity of neighbors who remembered Thomas's kindness. The $80 had bought him time, enough to keep the bank at bay through harvest season, but winter was coming, and with it the final reckoning he'd only postponed. Samuel sat on his porch as the sun died behind the western hills, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The ranch felt hollow around him, empty as a church after the last prayer. He let the cattle go to pay what debts he could, sold his father's tools to cover the rest. Now only the land remained, 20 acres of Kansas earth that had been Creek territory for 30 years, and would be for 30 more if he could find the strength to keep fighting. The sound came first as a whisper on the wind, hoofbeats in the distance, steady and familiar. Samuel's head lifted from his hands, his heart suddenly racing with a hope he didn't dare name. But as the rider drew closer through the gathering dusk, he saw the impossible truth painted against the darkening sky. Grace! She came a gallop, her chestnut coat dark with sweat, her mane streaming like a battle flag. But something was wrong. Her saddle sat empty, the stirrups dancing free, and her eyes, those gentle, trusting eyes, now rolled white with terror. She pulled up hard in the yard, foam flecking her mouth, her sides heaving like bellows. Samuel was off the porch and running before his mind caught up with his heart. Grace! Girl! The words died in his throat as he saw what hung from her saddlebags. Dark stains that could only be blood, still wet enough to catch the last light. His hands shook as he reached for her reins, and she shied away, nostrils flaring at some scent he couldn't name. Easy, girl. Easy. His voice came out broken, barely a whisper. What happened? Where's your rider? Grace stood trembling in the yard, her head turning constantly toward the road as if watching for pursuit. Samuel managed to catch her bridle, and she pressed against him with desperate relief. The same Grace who had comforted him through 100 heartaches, who had carried him and Thomas through all their boyhood adventures. But her saddlebags told a different story. When Samuel worked up the courage to open them, he found a stranger's belongings, a worn Bible, a pouch of silver coins, and a leather journal bound with string. The pages were water-stained and filled with cramped handwriting, but one name leaped out at him from the faded ink: Thomas Creek. Samuel's blood turned to ice water in his veins. The journal fell from his nerveless fingers, its pages scattering in the wind like dead leaves. Grace whinnied softly, and he looked up to see another rider approaching through the darkness, a man on a black horse, moving in an easy walk as if he had all the time in the world. The stranger rode into the circle of lamplight Samuel had left burning on the porch, and the years collapsed like a house of cards. Silver spurs caught the light as he dismounted, and when he smiled, Samuel saw the same cruel twist of lips that had haunted his nightmares for 3 years. Evening, the man said, his voice soft as snake oil. "Name's Jake Harrow. I believe that's my horse you got there." Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Harrow raised a lazy finger and shook his head. "Easy now, boy. I didn't come here for trouble. Just want what's mine. She's not yours." The words scraped Samuel's throat raw. "I sold her to Hutchins 2 months back." Harrow's laugh was like glass breaking. "Hutchins sold her to me fair and square. Been riding her ever since, matter of fact. Good horse, got spirit, got sense. Shame she took off on me like that, but horses can be funny about blood." The truth hit Samuel like a physical blow. Grace hadn't just returned, she'd run. Run from this man, this killer, carrying evidence of whatever fresh hell he'd committed. The blood on her saddlebags wasn't accident or misfortune. It was murder, and Grace had witnessed it all. "You're him," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "You're the one who killed Thomas." Harrow's smile widened, showing teeth yellow as old bone. "Thomas Creek. Now, there's a name I haven't heard in a spell. Good poker player, your brother. Shame he couldn't take losing like a man." The world tilted sideways, and Samuel had to grab Grace's saddle to keep from falling. 3 years of searching, 3 years of false leads and dead ends. And here was his brother's killer, standing in his own yard like some fever dream made flesh. "Funny thing," Harrow continued, patting his black horse's neck. "I've been carrying his things in my saddlebags ever since that night. Call it a trophy, call it a reminder. But that journal of his, well, it's been right interesting reading. All about this little ranch, about his brother Samuel, who'd do anything to keep the family land." Samuel's vision blurred red at the edges. His gun felt heavy as lead at his hip, but his hands remained steady. "You son of a bitch. Now. Harrow raised both hands in mock surrender. "No need for harsh words. I'm here on business, not pleasure. See, I've been thinking about settling down, finding a quiet place to rest these old bones. And this ranch of yours, well, it's exactly what I've been looking for." The insult cut deeper than any blade. This man had murdered Thomas, stolen his horse, and now wanted to take his land. Samuel's finger found the trigger of his Colt, the metal cold as winter iron. But Harrow was faster. His own gun appeared in his hand like magic, the barrel steady as a rock. "I wouldn't if I were you. I've killed better men than you for less reason than this." Grace stepped between them, her body shielding Samuel from the killer's aim. She stood perfectly still, her ears flat against her skull, every line of her body radiating the same protective instinct that had once made her Thomas's most treasured companion. "Smart horse," Harrow said admiringly. "She knows how this ends." Samuel stared over Grace's neck at the man who had destroyed his world and felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, which had shattered long ago, but something deeper. The last pretense that justice existed, that good men could win through virtue and determination alone. "What do you want?" Samuel asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Simple enough. I want you to sign over this ranch to me, legal and proper. In exchange, I'll tell you exactly how your brother died. Every word he spoke, every tear he shed. Might even show you where I buried what's left of my last business partner. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming rain and distant smoke. Grace shifted restlessly, her eyes never leaving Harrow's face, as if memorizing every line for some future reckoning. Samuel felt the weight of generations pressing down on his shoulders. His father's dreams, his mother's prayers, Thomas's sacrifice. All of it balanced on the edge of a killer's smile and the loyalty of a horse who had seen too much. "I need time to think," Samuel said finally. Harrow holstered his gun and tipped his hat. "Course you do. Tell you what, I'll make camp down by your creek tonight. Give you till morning to decide. But come sunrise, one way or another, this matter gets settled." He swung back into his saddle with practiced ease, then paused. "Oh, and Samuel, don't even think about running. Grace here knows my scent now, and she'll find me wherever I go. Horses never forget, you know. Never forgive, either." With that, he rode off into the darkness, leaving Samuel alone with his brother's horse and the terrible weight of impossible choices. Grace nuzzled his shoulder gently, and he buried his face in her mane, breathing in the familiar scent of home and heart. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, the same mournful sound that had echoed through Samuel's dreams for 3 long years. But tonight, it sounded less like grief and more like a warning. The storm was coming, and there would be nowhere left to hide. The killer who murdered his brother now wanted his land. And as the sun set on Samuel Creek's last day of freedom, he had to choose between losing everything or becoming the very thing he'd sworn to destroy. Dawn came gray and cold, painting the Kansas sky the color of old pewter. Samuel hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, with Jake Harrow camped by his creek like some demon waiting to collect a soul. All night he'd sat in his father's chair, cleaning and loading the old Colt that hadn't been fired since Thomas's funeral, when Samuel had put 3 shots into the cottonwood tree just to hear something louder than his own grief. Grace stood in the corral, her head turned toward the creek where thin smoke rose from Harrow's campfire. She hadn't touched her oats, hadn't drunk from the water trough. She just watched and waited, as if she knew this day would end in blood. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, and Samuel knew his time was running short. Harrow had given him until noon to decide, sign over the ranch or face the consequences. But there was a third choice, one that had been growing in Samuel's mind like a cancer through the long, dark hours. He could kill Jake Harrow. The thought should have horrified him. 3 years ago, before Thomas died, it would have. But grief changes a man, carves out places in his soul where darker things can take root. Samuel had seen enough of the world to know that some men were beyond redemption, beyond the reach of law or conscience. Harrow was such a man, a rabid dog that needed putting down before he could hurt anyone else. Samuel strapped on his gun belt and walked to the corral. Grace came to him immediately, pressing her soft muzzle against his chest. Her dark eyes held a depth of understanding that made his throat close up tight. "You know, don't you, girl?" he whispered, stroking her neck. "You know what has to happen." As if in answer, Grace turned her head toward the creek and nickered softly. Not a greeting, but something that sounded almost like a warning. Samuel saddled her with hands that remembered the motion from 1,000 mornings when the world had been simpler, when right and wrong weren't separated by the width of a trigger pull. Grace stood perfectly still as he tightened the cinch, her body coiled like a spring. They rode toward the creek at a walk, Samuel's heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The morning air tasted of dust and coming rain, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang the same sweet song Thomas used to whistle while doing chores. Harrow sat beside his dying fire, casually cleaning his gun with a piece of oiled cloth. He looked up as Samuel approached, and that cruel smile spread across his face like a stain. "Right on time," Harrow said, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "I do appreciate a man who keeps his word." "So what's it to be? Samuel Creek?" Your signature or your blood? Samuel dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun, but I've got a counter-offer. Do you now? Harrow's laugh was like breaking glass. I'm listening. Tell me how Thomas died. Every detail, every word. Do that, and I'll give you a fair chance to ride away from here alive. Harrow's eyes glittered with amusement. A fair chance? Son, I've killed 17 men in fair fights and twice that many in unfair ones. You really think you can outdraw Jake Harrow? Well, no, till I try. For a moment, Harrow studied Samuel's face, as if seeing something he hadn't expected. Then he shrugged and holstered his gun. Well, I'll be damned. The boy's got sand after all. All right, Samuel Creek. You want to know how your brother died? I'll tell you, and then I'll kill you with the same gun that put him in the ground. The wind died to nothing, leaving the world wrapped in terrible silence. Grace stood behind Samuel, her reins trailing loose, ready to run if things went badly. But her eyes never left Harrow's face, and Samuel could feel her presence like a blessing against his back. Thomas was winning, Harrow began, his voice soft and conversational. Had himself a good hand, 3 queens if memory serves. I was down to my last $20 and getting desperate. Man gets desperate, he does foolish things. Samuel's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Go on. I accused him of cheating. Wasn't true, mind you. Your brother was honest as spring water. But I needed him angry, needed him to do something stupid. So I called him a card sharp and a liar, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Samuel could see it all in his mind's eye. Thomas's face flushing red, his hands balling into fists. Thomas had never been able to back down from a challenge, never been able to let an insult slide. He stood up, Harrow continued, clearly enjoying the pain that flickered across Samuel's features. Told me to take it back or step outside. I chose outside naturally. More room to work. Samuel's hand trembled on his gun. He wasn't wearing iron that night. The sheriff said, sheriff was right. Thomas came out with empty hands, thinking we were going to settle it with fists. But I didn't want to fight him, son. I wanted to kill him. So when he got close enough, I put 2 in his chest and watched him fall. The words hit Samuel like physical blows. All these years, he'd imagined his brother going down fighting, dying with honor. But the truth was uglier. Thomas had been murdered in cold blood by a coward who couldn't win at cards. He didn't die right away, Harrow added with casual cruelty. Had time to speak his piece. Kept saying her name over and over. Tell Samuel, he'd say. Tell Samuel to take care of Grace. Even dying, he was worried about that damn horse. Grace whinnied sharply, a sound full of grief and recognition. She'd been there that night, Samuel realized. She'd watched Thomas die, had carried his body home across her back while his blood soaked into her coat. I took his money, Harrow went on. Took his watch, his silver belt buckle. Would have taken the horse too, but she wouldn't let me near her. Kicked like the devil every time I tried. Wasn't until I bought her proper from Hutchins that she settled down enough to ride. Samuel's vision blurred red at the edges. The colt felt light as a feather in his hand, eager to be drawn. You're done talking. Harrow's smile faded, replaced by something cold and predatory. Reckon I am. You sure about this, boy? I gave you a chance to walk away rich. Now I'm going to put you in the ground next to your brother. They stood 20 paces apart in the dusty space between the creek and the cottonwood tree. Grace had moved away, giving them room, but her eyes never left the 2 men who held her fate in their hands. Samuel's mouth felt dry as old leather. His heart hammered so hard he was sure Harrow could hear it. But his hand was steady, his mind clear. He thought of Thomas, not dying but living, laughing as they raced their horses across the prairie, singing off-key hymns in church, teaching Samuel to read sign and track deer and tell when a storm was coming. Your move, boy, Harrow called. Samuel drew. The world exploded into thunder and smoke. Samuel felt the wind of Harrow's bullet as it burned past his ear, saw the killer's eyes widen in surprise as Samuel's shot took him center mass. Harrow staggered backward, his gun falling from nerveless fingers, a look of profound amazement on his weathered face. "I'll be damned," he wheezed, pressing a hand to the spreading red stain on his shirt. "Faster than you looked." He felt his knees, then toppled forward into the dust beside the creek where the water ran clear and cold. For a moment, he tried to speak, his lips moving soundlessly. Then Jake Harrow, killer of 17 men in fair fights, breathed his last beside the cottonwood tree where Samuel's ancestors lay sleeping. Samuel stood frozen, the smoking gun heavy in his hand. He'd done it. After 3 years of searching, 3 years of failure, he'd finally brought Thomas's killer to justice. But the victory tasted like ashes in his mouth, and the silence that followed felt deeper than any grave. Grace walked over to Harrow's body and stood looking down at the man who had murdered her boy. She nudged his shoulder once with her muzzle, as if making sure he was truly dead, then turned away with what looked almost like satisfaction. Samuel holstered his gun and knelt beside the creek, splashing cold water on his face with shaking hands. The reflection that stared back at him was a stranger, hollow-eyed, hard-faced, marked by something that could never be washed away. He'd killed a man, looked him in the eye, and put a bullet through his heart. The fact that Harrow had deserved it, had been begging for it, didn't change what Samuel had become. A killer, just like the man lying dead in the dust. Grace came to stand beside him, her presence warm and solid as sunlight. Samuel reached up to stroke her neck, and she leaned into his touch the way she had when Thomas was alive. "Is it over?" Samuel whispered to the wind, to the water, to the ghost of his brother who might or might not be listening. "Is it finally over?" But the only answer was the sound of the creek running over stones, carrying away the last of Jake Harrow's blood toward the distant sea. He'd killed his brother's murderer with his own hands, but Samuel Creek was about to learn that some victories cost more than defeat, and some debts can only be paid with forgiveness. The shovel bit into the hard Kansas earth with a sound like breaking bones. Samuel had been digging for 2 hours, the sun climbing toward its zenith while sweat carved clean tracks through the dust on his face. Grace stood nearby, cropping grass with unusual contentment, as if some great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Jake Harrow's body lay wrapped in Samuel's old winter coat, the only shroud he could spare. It seemed wrong, somehow, to bury a killer in cloth that had kept Thomas warm through countless cold nights. But the dead deserved dignity, even the ones who'd forfeited their right to him. Samuel paused to wipe his brow and look toward the cottonwood tree where his brother slept. The carved initials were still there, SC and TC, surrounded by a lopsided heart they'd cut into the bark when Samuel was 10 and Thomas 12. Amazing how permanent those marks seemed now, how they'd outlasted the boys who'd made them. "Should have put him further away," Samuel muttered to Grace, who lifted her head and snorted as if in agreement. "Don't seem right, them being so close." But the ground was softer here by the creek, easier to work. And truth be told, Samuel didn't have the strength to dig elsewhere. The gunfight had drained something from him, not just the adrenaline that came with facing death, but something deeper. The burning need for vengeance that had kept him moving these past 3 years was gone, leaving behind a hollowness that felt almost like peace. The grave was finally deep enough. Samuel climbed out and dragged Harrow's body to the edge, then stopped. The man looked smaller in death, less terrible. Just another drifter who'd lost his way and never found it again. Samuel found himself wondering what Harrow had been like as a boy, before the world had carved the cruelty into his face. Had he carved his initials in trees? Had he loved a horse the way Thomas loved Grace? "Lord, forgive me," Samuel whispered, then lowered the body into the... He filled the grave slowly, each shovelful of dirt feeling heavier than the last. When it was done, he stood looking down at the unmarked mound and tried to feel something, satisfaction, closure, peace. But there was only emptiness where his hatred used to be. Grace wandered over and nudged his shoulder gently. Samuel reached up to scratch her ears, marveling at how she'd changed since yesterday. The wild fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. She'd carried the weight of that night in Millfield for 3 long years, had borne witness to Thomas's murder and been powerless to prevent it. Now, finally, justice had been served. "What do we do now, girl?" Samuel asked. "Where do we go from here?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Harrow was dead, but the ranch was still mortgaged to the hilt. Samuel still owed the bank more money than he could earn 5 years. Nothing had really changed, except now he was a killer too. He walked back to the house with Grace following behind, her hoofbeats soft on the dusty path. The porch looked different somehow, less like a place of mourning and more like what it had always been, home. Samuel sat on the steps where he and Thomas used to shell peas with their mother, where they'd whittled sticks and planned adventures that seemed possible when the world was young. The bank papers lay scattered on the kitchen table where he'd left them the night before. Final notices, foreclosure warnings, legal documents written in language designed to make a simple man feel stupid. Samuel gathered them up and carried them outside, then touched a match to the corner of the stack. The papers caught fire quickly, curling and blackening in the afternoon heat. Samuel watched them burn, feeling lighter with each page that turned to ash. Grace came to stand beside him, her breath warm on his neck. "Ain't running anymore," Samuel told her. "Whatever happens, happens, but I ain't running from it." The ashes scattered on the wind, and with them went the last of Samuel's fear. He lost everything that could be taken, his brother, his cattle, his savings, even his innocence. But he was still here, still breathing, still capable of choosing what came next. He thought about Harrow's journal, still lying where it had fallen the night before. All those names, all those places, all those stories of violence and loss. How many families had that man destroyed? How many brothers had died under his gun? The journal was evidence of crimes that would never see justice, secrets that would die with their keeper. Samuel gathered up the scattered pages and added them to the fire. Some truths were too heavy for the living to carry. Better to let them burn with the man who'd created them. As the flames died down, Samuel heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A rider was coming up the road. Not fast, not urgent, just the steady clip-clop of a horse and rider who had somewhere to be. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. He was done with killing, done with fear. The rider was Sheriff Matthews from Bitter Springs, a good man who'd known Thomas and had helped with the search in the early days. He pulled up in the yard and tipped his hat, his eyes taking in the scene. The fresh grave by the creek, the ashes at Samuel's feet, the blood-stained earth where the gunfight had taken place. "Samuel," the sheriff said quietly, "heard gunshots yesterday evening. Thought I ought to check." "Jake Harrow's dead," Samuel said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "He's the one killed Thomas 3 years ago. Came back for the ranch." Sheriff Matthews nodded slowly. "Harrow, you say?" "Been looking for a man by that name. Connected to some killings up in Colorado." He studied Samuel's face. "Self-defense. Fair fight." "He drew first." "Reckon he did." The sheriff dismounted and walked over to examine the grave. "Mind telling me what happened?" Samuel told him everything. Harrow's confession, his threats, the showdown by the creek. The sheriff listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking for clarification. When the story was finished, he stood quiet for a long moment, looking between Samuel and the grave. "Been a lot of men looking for Jake Harrow," he said finally. "A lot of families wanting justice. You done them all a service." "Doesn't feel like service," Samuel admitted. "Feels like—" He searched for words, then shrugged. "Like I became something I never wanted to be." Sheriff Matthews smiled sadly. "Sometimes the world don't give us a choice about what we become. Only choice is whether we let it make us bitter or make us better." He remounted his horse and gathered the reins. "There'll be paperwork, eventually. Inquest, most likely. But far as I'm concerned, Jake Harrow got exactly what he deserved. World is a safer place without him." After the sheriff left, Samuel stood alone in his yard with Grace for company and tried to figure out what came next. The ranch was still doomed. He couldn't work miracles with bare hands and an empty bank, but maybe that was all right. Maybe some things were meant to end so other things could begin. He thought about Grace, about what would happen to her when the bank came calling. She deserved better than to be sold again, deserved to live out her days somewhere she was loved and understood. Maybe the Hendersons would take her. They had children who would appreciate her gentle ways, land enough to let her run. But as if reading his thoughts, Grace moved to stand directly in front of him, her dark eyes holding his with an intensity that took his breath away. This was Thomas's horse, but she was also his now. She'd chosen him, had brought Harrow back to face justice, had stood by him through the darkest hours of his life. "All right, girl," Samuel said, reaching up to stroke her neck. "We'll figure out together. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Samuel looked toward the cottonwood tree where two graves lay side by side, one marked with love, the other with nothing but necessity. Thomas would have forgiven Harrow, eventually. That was his way, his gift. Samuel wasn't there yet, might never be, but the rage was gone. In its place was something quieter, something that felt almost like peace. Grace whinnied softly and pressed her muzzle against his chest, her warmth spreading through him like sunlight. They stood together as the stars came out, two survivors who'd found their way back from the darkness, ready to face whatever morning might bring. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, the sound of journeys beginning, of people moving toward uncertain but hopeful futures. Samuel listened until it faded, then turned toward the house where lamplight waited in the windows and coffee grew cold on the stove. Tomorrow there would be decisions to make, papers to sign, a future to build from the ashes of the past. But tonight there was only this, a man, a horse, and the enduring bonds that death itself could not break. The cottonwood tree rustled in the evening breeze, its leaves whispering secrets to the stars. And if Samuel listened carefully, he could almost hear his brother's voice in that gentle sound. Not mourning anymore, but blessing. Offering the one gift Thomas had always been best at giving, forgiveness. Grace nickered once, soft and low, then followed Samuel toward the warm yellow light of home.